Good evening, everyone. I was just smiling and looking and reminiscing over those pictures that were just going through the slide deck there. Some very familiar faces and some, patients that we helped along the way. Just very, very nice to see. With no further ado, my name is David Aladra, and I want to welcome you all to the UW Health Transplant Center Research Update. I am an assistant professor in the Division of Transplant Surgery, and I specialize in liver, kidney, and pancreas transplantation. I do both pediatrics as well as adult transplants, and I'm actively involved in both the living liver donor program as well as the living kidney donor program. In addition to those things, I also do hepatobiliary surgery for oncological reasons. I'm very happy to be your guide through tonight's presentations. And on behalf of our researchers and physicians, I want to express my gratitude for the many ways in which you continue to support transplant research and patient care. Gathering tonight this evening in this format is one way that we can thank you for your support. It also gives us a chance to show you and demonstrate to you and direct members of the other members of the community some of the research that we are doing at UW and where your contributions are going. Can you have the next slide, please? Thank you. It is my pleasure to welcome our fundraising and development team, who some of you may already know. I invite you to meet or reconnect with any one of these members of the team following tonight's presentation via their email addresses. We'll also be putting some links into the chat bars to quickly access them. Next slide, please. I would like to take a few moments and update, or maybe one slide too fast. I'd like to take a few moments and provide updates. Actually, we can do this one first. We are doing, this is the philanthropic donation that was for our new transplant center, our Pleasant T. Rowland Transplant Clinic. As many of you know, this clinic was made possible by a $10 million gift from Ms. Rowland as an expression of her gratitude towards her kidney donor and the care she received from our transplant program. The clinic opened on September 6th, and the patients and staff are more than happy to be enjoying this new wonderful space on the main floor and actually get some windows as opposed to our transplant center that used to be in the basement without seeing the light of day. If any of you would like to see see photos of the new clinic, we'll be posting those links in the chat bar and the comment bar. And of course, you're also welcome to stop by the clinic anytime you're near the University Hospital. I'll go back to provide some other milestones for our transplant center before moving on to the presentations, just to keep everyone updated. In August, we celebrated the 40th year of our pancreas transplant program. We are the nation's largest kidney and pancreas transplant program and the second largest pancreas transplant alone program. We're proud to continue supporting patients from all across the nation. In September, we completed our 3,000th liver transplant. This placed us in the top 15 largest liver programs of the nation's 176 liver transplant programs. We have a strong adult and pediatric liver transplant team, and are very excited to welcome Dr. Kelly Collins as our new surgical director for pediatric liver and kidney transplantation. Dr. Collins makes her way from the Henry Ford in Detroit back to Madison, which is actually her hometown. On other news, we're also near our 12,000th kidney transplant. I'm so proud to share that this milestone makes us the program who has transplanted the most kidneys in the whole nation. We are in our 56th year of kidney transplantation, and it's absolutely wonderful to think of these 12,000 patients who are out there off dialysis, living better lives, contributing to their communities. You may have also heard in the news that UNOS, the United Network for Organ Sharing, recently announced that there have been 1 million organ transplants in the United States. And I'm proud also to let you know that UW is just one of these centers that is contributing so many transplants to that 1 million number. We've always been one of the nation's largest and most active transplant centers. And I thought that by sharing some of these milestones, it'd be a good reminder that we're always growing and always focused on new ways we can serve even more and more patients. Can we put back up the other slide for the philanthropy, please? Fantastic. In May of this year, the UW School of Medicine and Public Health and UW Health united to publicly announce its first ever combined comprehensive philanthropic campaign called Wisconsin Medicine, The Future Needs Us Now. The financial support of this community is truly a driving force behind the success of our researchers and physicians. Since we launched our philanthropic efforts in 2015, $27.3 million were donated to advance research, education, and help ease the financial burdens some patients and families experience during their transplant journeys. We continue to help many patients, adults and children, and it's because of this generosity that we can continue to support patients who are in need of things like hotel stays, rent assistance, gas cards, and more. And after that brief introduction, I think we'll start doing our presentations. So I'm going to be giving the first presentation, followed by Dr. Dan McCarthy. My topic is going to be on organ preservation, and I want to talk about organ regeneration and how we've done things in the past, present, and future. My research really aims around trying to decrease organ rejection after transplantation, which would decrease the amount of immune response to the amount of rejection that occurs, and hopefully get rid of some of these harmful anti-rejection drugs. Research in the Division of Transplantation is made possible through philanthropic gifts, such as ones from the Virginia Lee Cook Foundation. In addition, my research has been partially supported by David and Deborah Penn. I'll give some information later on, but I'll point out exactly where their contribution has helped provide my lab with preliminary data required for larger NIH funding. Before I start with my presentation, going through this in practice, I've been told by some of the members of our production team that some of my images are gory, and so I needed to give a bit of a disclaimer. However, I don't think they're gory. I think that they show that they are, active and functioning organs, and these things are actually very beautiful to my eye. So you might call them gory, but I think they're quite beautiful. In addition, Halloween's only a few weeks away, so I think we're allowed to have a little bit of gore for this presentation. Before I begin, also, I just ask that there is an active chat function, and please type in your questions into the chat function. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can in our question and answer period, which will happen at the conclusion of the presentations. So to begin, my talk is to familiarize the audience with the important aspects of organ storage prior to transplantation. Organ storage is a necessary part of transplantation. When an organ is removed from the donor, it has to be transported to where the recipient is and implanted. This is a very important part of the organ transplant process. And so I want to give an update on the important aspects of that, as well as provide an overview of some of the new ways we are doing this organ storage, including pumping organs at normal body temperatures. Next slide, please. So to begin, we'll talk about organ storage and the history of it. Next slide, please. So the goal really is to maintain the graft in a livable state or in a viable state. As I mentioned, the time that happens between the organ procurement from a donor, which can be at a hospital pretty much anywhere in the country, the organ needs to be taken from that donor and transported to the recipient hospital and then implanted into the recipient. During this transport time, the organ needs to be stored in such a fashion that can maintain graft viability. Some of the specifics on a cellular level are to stop some of the salts shifting back and forth between the cells, which can cause cell swelling or cell death. Balancing the acids and bases or the pH of this solution all needs to be done in a manner that this organ can survive. And very importantly, once the organ is connected to the recipient, and blood gets reinfused into this organ and it starts functioning again, there is a potential for what's called reperfusion injury, or when the organ gets new blood again, injury can happen if it has not been properly stored. Next slide, please. So going back to the very early experience, one of the ways that people recognized very early on was that transporting an organ at room temperature or at body temperatures was not going to be good. There was too much metabolic demand or too much active cellular activity in order to keep that organ viable. And so therefore, it was recognized quite early on, these organs needed to be cooled down to 4 degrees or as cold as they could get without freezing them in order to provide decreased metabolic activity and prolong the transport time. Excuse me. The very early experience of these were blood-based. They used hyperbaric oxygen chambers, same thing that people use after diving injuries, kept cold at 4 degrees, and pumping, for the liver anyway, pumping solutions through the major blood vessels. So as you can imagine, these things, hyperbaric oxygen, a cooler to keep it at 4 degrees, a lot of pumps, these are very complicated machines in the early experience. Next slide, please. This is demonstrated in this paper from 1968, one of the first human liver transplants done by Thomas Starzl, who's considered one of the fathers of liver transplantation. And in the blue underlining there you can see exactly that. They were hypothermic, so kept cold at 4 degrees, hyperbaric oxygen, which means they were kept at a higher oxygen pressure, and pumps going through the arteries and the veins of the liver. Next slide, please. Despite how cumbersome they actually did work. So they were effective. These basic pumps and basic equipment, they were described as unwieldy and, very difficult to transport, but they were successful and they were used. Next slide, please. However, because they were so unwieldy and so large and fraught with complications, mechanical complications, everyone was looking out for the next best thing. And the next best thing came out from the University of Wisconsin. So here's this paper from 1986, published at the University of Wisconsin with Dr. Belzer. This is the first description of what came to then be called the University of Wisconsin cold storage solution. This solution has revolutionized transplantation. So since its inception back in the mid-'80s, it rapidly changed the way organs were stored from that time between the donor and the recipient. Next slide, please. So what became known as static cold storage, static just means that there's no more pumps to pump the blood or perfusion around. And it kept cold. Excuse me, these were specialized solutions that decreased graft metabolism because they were kept at 4 degrees. They were portable, they were simple, they were cheap, can store livers for longer periods of time. And in contrast to the quotes calling the other machines unwieldy, most people would call these revolutionary. And because of its ease, this rapidly replaced the perfusion efforts that were shown in those papers from the 60s. So rapidly, perfusion went away and organs were just kept in ice boxes called static cold storage. Next slide, please. However, we know that in this country and in many countries around the world, there is an organ shortage problem. There are many more patients who require organs than there are donors to provide those organs to them. Therefore, trying to decrease these waiting times and getting people off of the waiting list and getting them transplanted, we're turning more and more to organs that may have been discarded historically. For example, a donor who might be older, or for liver especially, a donor who might be overweight, which can then lead to having a fattier liver. We're looking at these organs more and more to try to use them in order to get people off of the transplant waiting list, because even using some of these marginal organs, patients will live longer and live better. However, these marginal organs don't tolerate the static cold storage very well. So if there's an older donor or a donor with a fattier liver or a higher risk kidney, these organs, if they're just flushed with the University of Wisconsin solution and kept cold in an icebox, they don't function as well after reperfusion or after implantation into the recipient. Next slide, please. So that's when the solution of normothermic ex vivo perfusion came around. Now it's a big mouthful, so I'll break it down. Normothermic means normal body temperatures. Ex vivo means outside of the body. And perfusion means that we're back to using these pumps to actually perfuse a solution, either blood-based or solution-based, through the organ itself while it's being stored. By keeping the organ happy with oxygen and nutrients and being pumped for periods of time, the organs actually can regain their function between that transport time from donor to recipient. So in the graphic here in the top left corner, the current approach is the ice bucket. The liver is stored, or the kidney or heart or anything else is stored in a bag full of University of Wisconsin solution in an ice bucket. And the bottom slide in the left-hand part talks about NMP, or normothermic machine preservation, where the organ is perfused with blood and oxygenated, and it's stored in that manner. On the right-hand side, panel C, is the future directions, which we'll talk about later on. But this really might provide an opportunity not only to use these organs that may be marginal in the first place, but also take even more marginal organs and planning on repairing them, or can we fix the damage that has occurred to them? Next slide, please. So I'll move now into normothermic organ perfusion systems. These machines, why they came around now, is really because of advances in technology. As opposed to the machines that are available in the late 60s, everything is smaller now. The technology is much improved. There's better sensors. The pumps are better, longer battery lives. Everything is better. And now that everything is improved, they've also managed to condense these machines into very small, semi-portable, well, I should say portable, talk more about that in a moment, portable machines. These are two examples that are being used for the liver. The top one is the TransMedics device, which stores the liver inside of the chamber in the center of the screen. And the bottom right is a machine called the OrganOx Metro device. This is the one that we have at the University of Wisconsin. And as you can see, there's a bag of blood that's hanging there, and through some pumps and tubes, it's connected to that white container on the right-hand side, which houses the organ, which houses the liver. Next slide, please. And these machines are coming. So not only are they available for livers, they are available for lungs, for kidneys, for hearts, and there's even some recent papers that came out this year talking about normothermic perfusion for pancreas allografts. Next slide, please. So the benefits of these machines, there's many potential benefits to them. The first and foremost is it can stop this reperfusion injury. So once the organ is connected back to the recipient or connected into the recipient, the rush of warm blood isn't such a shock anymore because the liver or the kidney or whatever is already warm. So it's not that shock of a reperfusion injury. And therefore, there's decreased bile duct problems for liver and decreased delayed graft function for kidneys. In addition, we can do what's called organ functional assessment. So let's say we remove a donor organ from an individual and we're not sure it's going to work. Well, the ways of doing things before is one, if we were really unsure if it was going to work, we would probably discard that organ. Or two, we would transplant it and just keep all of our fingers crossed, hoping that it was going to work. This, of course, with a bit of, I'm saying it with a bit of a grain of salt. Of course, we transplant organs that we feel are most likely going to be working. But these machines can really give us a lot more confidence. We can actually put these organs onto a machine and watch the organs function by themselves. So therefore, it gives us confidence to say, well, look, once we transplant it, it's probably still going to function as well. The last main benefit is facilitating logistics. So it's not uncommon that we have 3 liver offers, and we need to have 3 different operating rooms with 3 different surgeons, which just is not possible all the time. That's too many surgeons, too many operating rooms, and not enough. So if these machines can be perfusing an organ for long periods of time, like 12 hours, one can stay on the pump while we finish our first transplant and move on to the next one. The last thing I wrote there is daytime transplantation. I'm not saying that because I like sleeping at nighttime, but I'm saying that because for every other major surgery, it would be absurd to start a major abdominal surgery at midnight. But for transplant, we do it all the time. It would be absurd to say, hey, you're having a major cancer surgery done, we're going to start at 9 p.m. No, that's unheard of. But for transplant, it just seems to be par for the course. Whereas we know that daytime transplantations do have better results, therefore it might facilitate some of these logistics. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to demonstrate a couple of real-world examples of normothermic machine perfusion. The first one I'll start off with is by talking about the OrganOx Metro device again. There was a large clinical trial done in the United States, and we actually did the first OrganOx device in the US, the University of Wisconsin, in November of 2016. So this is our team, as well as some of the OrganOx members doing our first liver on this machine perfusion pump. Next slide, please. Here's an example of the liver, which again, some people call this gory. I think it's beautiful. It's a nice liver, nice color. It looks perfect. All those cannulas that are into all the major arteries and major veins are both pumping the liver with blood, removing that blood and recirculating it after oxygenating it and warming it up. And again, another picture of the machine on the right-hand side in action. So I'll give a case, and there's some specifics of this case. They're all there for some who know more about these type of donors than others, but I'll go through it for everybody. This is a donor, what was called donation after cardiocirculatory death. This is a type of donor that we often do that are not brain dead, but they have no meaningful chance of life and have signed the donor organ cards. Families agreed to donate. So we withdraw life support from these individuals, and their heart stops, circulation stops. Once that happens, we're able to remove those organs for transplantation. For that period of time that circulation has stopped, the organs are not receiving blood. They're not receiving oxygen. So the organs don't like that as much, especially the liver. So there have been some increased complications with using livers such as these, which are getting less and less complicated, but there have been some complications with these. This donor age was 31 to 40 years old. it took 12 minutes for this patient to pass away once the life support had withdrawn. So this was a usable liver. The liver came out quite quickly, and then we planned to put it onto the OrganOx device. We kept this liver nice and cold while we sewed in all those cannulas that you saw in the last picture, which took us about 2.5, 3 hours, which is pretty standard for this. They can be quite labor intensive, and we'll talk more about that later on. Next slide, please. The recipient was a almost 60-year-old male who was getting a liver transplant for alcoholic cirrhosis, and after being put to sleep under anesthesia, he had a bad heart attack. So did not tolerate the induction of anesthesia very well. We did what's called an echocardiogram, or an ultrasound of his heart, which showed very poor heart function. And therefore we thought this is unsafe to proceed with a transplant at this time. We have to, get him better from this, get his heart better from this, transplant him in the future. So now essentially this liver from this cardiac death donor was sitting in an ice box already for 2 hours while we were getting everything sewn in. And this is an absolute nightmare situation. So I can tell you honestly that if there was an offer that came right now of a liver from a cardiac death donor that was sitting in an ice bucket for 2 hours, I would probably cancel it. I wouldn't accept that organ for anybody on our transplant waiting list, because by the time we called in a recipient, got them through anesthesia, that organ would be sitting in an ice bucket for way too long, and this would be too much of a marginal liver to transplant. Next slide, please. So however, this liver was on the OrganOx machine device. So we called in a new recipient who had a different indication for liver disease. We called him in at 11 o'clock in the morning, came in by noon, and then 2 hours later, he was being put to sleep by our anesthesiologists. The case was pretty uncomplicated. Total time on the OrganOx device was 9.5 hours. So again, there would be no transplant center, I don't believe, in the United States who would transplant a liver 9.5 hours after a deceased after cardiac death liver. But this OrganOx saved this liver, allowed it to be transplanted, and 3 years later, this guy's doing just perfectly. Next slide, please. So should we do it for everybody? That's a very good question. Cold static storage is cheap, reliable, portable, and simple. And normal thermal machine perfusion is more expensive. There's a lot of moving parts to it. It's reliable, but there is always potential for breakdown. These machines are getting smaller and more portable, but currently we can't fly with them. We just can drive with them. And they are very complicated. So I believe that static cold storage is not going away anytime soon. There are many organs that are not marginal that tolerate static cold storage just fine. And I think it's going to be a viable method for transplanting organs for the foreseeable future. Normothermic machine perfusion, I believe, does have its niche, though, of expanding the donor pool, assessing functionality, and treating organs, which we'll talk about in a moment. Next slide, please. This is an example of when machines break down. So this is me after spending about 2.5 hours putting a liver, sewing in cannulas into this liver to try to put it onto the OrganOx machine device in the background there. And while we were plugging in the machine, one of the electrical sockets was loose and jiggling. And we tried some troubleshooting for a while. And although the machine was functioning, the sponsors, the people who own the machine said, look, it's just not safe to use. We just don't know what's happening. Don't use the machine. And so here's me after spending 2.5 hours trying to put this liver on the machine, unable to do so. Now, this liver was not lost. This liver was still cold stored. We still were able to store it, like I said, in this very viable, commonly used static cold storage. So my line for these machines is kind of what Mitch Hedberg said once, is that an elevator can never become broken. It can only become stairs. So similarly, these machines can't really break. They always can just become ice boxes. Next slide, please. So this is the list of potential benefits that I put up previously. And now I'm going to turn my attention to the very last point, which was just added, which is the optimization of marginal grafts, or what can we do to make transplants better? And that's where I'll spend my last few minutes. Basically, if we have an organ that is injured, it's a fatty liver, or we want to decrease rejection, or it's one of these marginal donors I was talking about, there's an opportunity now to do some type of therapeutic intervention while these organs are on their perfusion machines. And this can lead to organ optimization prior to transplantation. Next slide, please. This really can allow for individualized organ functional assessments and able to modify these organs by themselves. As you can imagine, there would be a lot of ethical and logistical considerations of treating the donor themselves. Let's say for the liver, I want to treat this liver with some type of therapeutic agent. but the kidney team doesn't want that done. So therefore, we can't really, one doesn't surpass the other. So therefore, we would not be able to do so. But these machines, when the organs are all split apart and put onto their individual machines, this really can allow for personalized assessments and personalized medicine to be conducted on them. Next slide, please. And now to give some research into my lab. As I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, my lab is focused on preventing rejection. And so rejection is a major form of graft loss after organ transplantation, most commonly for things like kidneys, lungs, and pancreases, but livers also get rejected, and it can decrease graft loss and decrease patient survival. So we're trying to stop this from happening. And so the question I ask is, can the organ itself be modified to cause less rejection after transplantation? Next slide, please. This is an example of a gross-looking cirrhotic nodular liver. This liver needs to come out. So this is the patient's original liver. Next slide, please. We can change that to a liver that is nice and clean around edges. However, once we do that, the recipient's immune cells start coming in. So here's a schematic of a couple of different cells, this CD4 and CD8 T cells coming in wanting to attack this liver. And they will attack this liver, which is why we use anti-rejection drugs or immunosuppression drugs. But what if the organ itself could hold up that stop sign and say, hang on, wait a second, don't attack me. I'm part of you, don't harm me. This may allow us to decrease rejection as well as decrease the amount of these immunosuppression and anti-rejection drugs that patients take. Next slide, please. This was going to be a video of a liver being perfused in my lab. This is a rat liver. You can see my thumb in the bottom left-hand corner there. So there's a pretty small liver. It weighs about 15 grams. And there's a cannula placed into one of the veins into it. And then we perfuse this with solution to keep this liver functioning. I think on the next slide here, I actually have some still pictures of the, next slide, please. So here's some still pictures of a liver in the left-hand side that has some bile being produced in it. There's another little cannula inside of the bile duct, which is making bile. And the kidneys that we perfuse in my lab, again, those cannulas go through the arteries and through the veins. And we look at the ureter, what connects to the bladder, and you can see it's making some urine there. And there's a penny in the insert there just for a size comparison. These are all very small things that we're doing with these small animals. Next slide, please. This is where the Hope Meet Gratitude or my research was made benefit by David and Deborah Penn. We tried to put a protein into a kidney that would stop it from being rejected. And we were partially successful in doing this. And this allowed us to gain a lot of preliminary data that we are now applying for a larger NIH funding to continue on this line of research. Just to walk through it very quickly here, on the left-hand side of column A, there's a kidney that's glowing orange and yellow and red. This is a kidney that's expressing the protein of interest under fluorescence. The control kidneys are the faint red and the black ones on the right-hand side top and right-hand side bottom, just for comparison of a kidney that we have induced this protein to be expressed in. The middle panel there just shows the ration to detect this protein on a microscopic level. It's these brownish type areas that are stained, and so we can actually express this protein in different parts of the kidney cells. And this, again, those brown stains in part B are absent in part C, which is the control kidney. Next slide, please. So in summary, increasing use of marginal organs requires a different method of organ storage. Normothermic machine preservation is a rapidly expanding field. And I hope I've shown you there are numerous benefits to this technology. And beyond just increasing the absolute number of organs that can be transplanted using marginal organs, we can also make organs better for transplantation. Thank you very much for your attention to my portion of the presentation. And again, I would just encourage you to, if there are any questions, comments that you want to make, please place them into the chat, and we'll be happy to get to those later on. Our next speaker is Dr. Daniel McCarthy, who will be giving his presentation, and then he will be joined by Dr. Aaron Lowry for the discussion section later on. Dr. Daniel McCarthy is an assistant professor in the section of thoracic surgery, division of cardiothoracic surgery. He serves as a surgical director of the lung transplant program. Dr. McCarthy's research Interests are focused on improving lung transplant outcomes through prehabilitation before transplant and enhanced recovery after lung transplant surgery. He is working with collaborators to identify imaging metrics of frailty and their link to clinical assessments and post-transplant outcomes. He's also exploring the impact of a novel narcotic-sparing or opioid-sparing pain control protocol in clinical outcomes after lung transplantation. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniel McCarthy.
Thank you, David. Next slide, please. So I'll be talking about lung transplant in the era of COVID-19. Next slide. When I think back on the beginning of the COVID pandemic, it feels like, fragments from a bad dream. This was a frightening and confusing time, particularly for us in the transplant community, whose patients were particularly susceptible to these infections. We didn't know how to protect our family, ourselves, our patients. There were so many unknowns. Next slide. We didn't know if we were going to have the resources to take care of patients when they got sick or to transplant patients when they needed transplant. This is an image of the field hospital that was set up on the state fairgrounds outside of Milwaukee in October of 2020 during the big surge here in Wisconsin. Next slide. Although everybody was affected by COVID, COVID did have a unique impact on lung transplant patients in the lung transplant community. This is a sad story of friends at the University of Michigan who transplanted inadvertently a set of lungs that contained COVID into a recipient. The donor died in a car accident, had no symptoms of COVID, and underwent a comprehensive evaluation like all donors, which included at the time a nasal swab that was negative for COVID. Nevertheless, the implanting surgeon contracted COVID from these donor lungs and was out for several weeks before thankfully recovering fully. Unfortunately, the recipient did not do so well, and approximately 2 months after transplant, the recipient passed. Now, this did lead to changes in the way that we assess donors. We now know that nasopharyngeal swabs are insufficient for determining whether lung donors are adequate, and all lung donors in the United States are tested for COVID from lower respiratory tract samples. But COVID didn't just change the way that we do lung transplant, it also changed why we do lung transplant. Next slide, please. In 2021, COVID-19 was the number 3 reason for lung transplant in the United States, accounting for over 10% of the total lung transplant volume. Next slide. The first lung transplant for COVID in the United States was done by colleagues at Northwestern University in June of 2020. This was for what's called acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is the most severe form of COVID-19 that results in a devastating illness requiring mechanical ventilation, and in many cases, in addition to the mechanical ventilator, use of artificial lung machine called ECMO. Next slide, please. 5 months later, the University of Wisconsin joined an elite group of programs performing lung transplant for COVID in the United States. And we were actually the first team to describe a different reason for transplant in COVID patients. It was called post-COVID pulmonary fibrosis, which is related to a development of scar in the lungs that can even occur in patients who had less severe forms of the disease and never ended up on the ventilator. Next slide. But I think we're all sick and tired of hearing about the bad things that happened in COVID. And so for the rest of my talk, I'm going to be focusing on the silver linings. COVID forced us to be innovative and creative and test our limits. And some of the lessons that we learned during this time can be applied to all lung transplant patients. So I'll be focusing on two particular areas, increasing access to organs and prehabilitation, which have become important areas that we emphasize both clinically at the University of Wisconsin, as well as in our research practices. Next slide. And to do this, I want to highlight the story of two incredible women. Next slide. The first case is a young woman in her 50s. She's healthy. She was physically active. And she used her vitality to give back to her community, working as a community organizer in Milwaukee. She contracted COVID during the first wave in the summer of 2020 and was sick enough to be hospitalized and transferred to the intensive care unit for several weeks. And although she didn't require mechanical ventilation, she was quite ill. Fortunately, she made progress, left the intensive care unit, but did not recover enough to be able to go home. She still required so much oxygen that she simply couldn't have that much oxygen provided to her at home. So she was transferred to a skilled nursing facility in the nearby region with the hopes that she would demonstrate ongoing recovery. Unfortunately, after several months, she remained trapped in this nursing facility. And ultimately, her doctors reached out to us for consideration of lung transplant. Next slide. She was suffering from this type of disease that we call post-COVID pulmonary fibrosis. You can see in the CAT scan on the right the significant difference in the lungs compared to the darker, more normal lungs on the left. Post-COVID pulmonary fibrosis results in significant scar buildup in the lungs that prevents them from transferring oxygen and carbon dioxide the way they're supposed to. Next slide. Now, this was a very strong woman. She had fought for months to recover, to get better. You can see this is a snapshot from an interview she gave from the hospital while waiting for lung transplant. But she was also running out of time. Next slide. Here you can see that in just the 2 weeks that she was with us, progression of her disease. On the left, the lung highlighted by the arrow progressed to the image on the right, where there was more white change suggesting increased inflammation, which correlated with increased oxygen requirements. She was no longer able to walk because of how hypoxic she was. Next slide. After listing her for transplant, we were able to find a suitable donor organ in only 6 days. She underwent a double lung transplant and was off the ventilator the day after surgery and discharged from the hospital in less than 2 weeks. In the next slide, we'll show you a video that highlights some elements of her story.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. I wish you the best.
Thank you. No, look at me getting all emotional now.
Don't be. It was, yeah.
It's been a...
It's hard to know how much time Carmen would have had. Even in the 2 weeks that she was with us in the hospital, although she was committed and working hard, we saw a decline in her function to the point where we did actually place her on the artificial lung machine.
Outside the door. Hey. My heart was pounding. I haven't seen them in a while, so to just get up and come to them, it's priceless. I've never thought that I would be able to do this again. So I really want to take a moment to thank UW Health, the doctors, all the nurses. It's been amazing. A rough journey, but a great ending.
Now, you might imagine that after a harrowing battle like that, she had earned the right to relax. But anybody that knows this inspiring woman would not be surprised to hear that, within months of her transplant, she was already out working to give back to the community, raising awareness of the importance of COVID vaccines. Next slide. So I think, although there are many lessons from this story, what I want to do is highlight how this showed us the importance of access to donor lungs. Next slide. And we'll talk a little bit about what we're doing to increase organ access. Next slide. In transplant, we often talk about this window of opportunity. Transplant patients are sick enough that they require organ replacement, but they're not so sick that they cannot, that they won't be able to tolerate the operation and the recovery. So it's important that in this window of time, we identify acceptable organs for transplant, because if we can't find those organs in time, it's possible that patients may progress to the point where they're no longer candidates and cannot tolerate what's necessary to get them through that recovery. Next slide, please. In the United States, although we've made some improvements, still nearly 15% of patients die on the lung transplant wait list. Next slide. This has been an important focus of efforts at our program for several years now. This slide shows some results from our most recent publicly reported outcomes, which shows our waitlist mortality over the past 2.5 years, which includes the majority of the COVID pandemic. And in that period of time, none of our patients, 0% of our patients died on the wait list. We were able to get everybody successfully to transplant, and we're very proud of that. Next slide. There are a variety of ways to do it, but many, essentially this comes down to increasing the number of donors and increasing utilization of the donors that we have. There are some innovative protocols that allow programs to access types of donors that not all programs have the expertise at using. And then there's techniques that we can use to make the most of the donors that are available. In Carmen's case, we identified excellent functioning lungs that were too big for her. And we used what's called graft volume reduction, a technique to reduce the size of those lungs in a way that allowed them to match the size of her chest cavity. Another emerging technique is what you've already heard about in Dr. Aladra's talk for livers. It's called ex vivo lung perfusion. On the right, you'll see a picture of lungs on a setup that we have as part of an industry study here at the University of Wisconsin, where we ventilate donated lungs, donated research lungs, and analyze their performance with use of surgical staplers. Next slide. And although at our institution, we don't use ex vivo perfusion for clinical practice, we don't need to, because in the lung field, ex vivo lung perfusion has been around for some time. And in fact, in terms of clinical utilization, it's one of the first organ groups to use ex vivo perfusion, to the point where now there's a commercially available service. We partner with a company called Lung Bioengineering, and we recover lungs from the donors. And if we're not confident that these lungs are good enough for our recipients, then we send these lungs to this company, and they put it on a special system that you can see in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. And on that system, the lungs are ventilated and perfused for up to 6 hours outside of any human body. We can do a variety of additional tests on the lungs to confirm their quality before implanting them in our recipients. We can do an X-ray, we can measure pressures, we can look at gas exchange. And that allows us access to this technique without having to have the internal infrastructure, which is actually quite complicated and resource intensive. Next slide. But there's other ways to enhance the use of existing organs that don't require that level of sophistication. There's increasing recognition now that the techniques that we use for organ transport may actually contribute to the damage that the lungs sustain. Oftentimes the coolers and the ice that we use to transport these life-saving organs are simply the same coolers that you might use at a weekend barbecue. And although the target is to keep these lungs cold, they can be too cold. And in fact, there's evidence to suggest from these, as shown in these thermal imaging pictures, that when the lungs arrive, they may actually be substantially colder than the 4 degrees Celsius that historically was designated as the sort of correct temperature. And in fact, there's increasing data to suggest that even warmer, perhaps 10 degrees Celsius, is the best temperature to maintain donated lungs. But this doesn't necessarily require sophisticated techniques. In fact, the members of our lung transplant team are looking into ways to use off-the-shelf technology, coolers, thermal regulators, to ensure that the lungs are transported at the temperatures that we want. Next slide. So it's actually a really exciting time to be at the University of Wisconsin, where we have an ecosystem with folks like Dr. El Adra, members of our team, and others who are interested in these innovative techniques. And we may really be at a turning point, similar to what Dr. Belzer and Dr. Souther were at when they invented the UW solution. But ideas are not enough. Ideas are a spark. They require kindling to set fire, and that kindling may take the form of a pilot grant or a philanthropic gift that allows us to at least develop the initial data to prove whether an idea is potentially successful before allowing that fire to grow into clinically relevant developments. Next slide, please. The second case is best summarized already by my colleagues in UW marketing. So we'll just go directly to the video of case number 2.
This is a story of new life, near death, and the people who helped save Darlene's life. In September of 2021, Darlene was infected with COVID-19. She was 37 weeks pregnant at the time. She was admitted into UW Health Swedish American Hospital.
They decided that I needed to have the baby delivered because my body was kind of in distress and it was affecting her. The next day, September 16th, they delivered Hazel.
Darlene only got to spend about 2 days with Hazel.
They sent her home with my husband, and I went to the ICU. I was in the ICU for 2 months, and during that time, my lungs completely deteriorated and they just failed. I was put kind of in like a medically induced coma and intubated. So I was paralyzed and I was alive, but I wasn't living.
On October 26th, doctors told Darlene's husband, Lincoln, that his wife probably wouldn't survive the night.
This wasn't how it was supposed to be. We were supposed to grow old together, raise our family, and live our life.
They didn't think I was going to make it, and then the next morning I was still there.
Darlene was fighting for her life. She needed new lungs and a place to get stronger to be eligible for a transplant. She was turned down by multiple transplant centers in the region, but UW Health's University Hospital in Madison agreed to take her.
When we first met her, I think the odds of her getting through this successfully were slim. I think, honestly, the odds were more that she wouldn't make it than that she would.
The first hurdle, transporting Darlene. UW Health MedFlight is one of the few services in the country that specializes in using nitric oxide on board, an essential tool to keep Darlene alive on the flight.
I honestly don't know if she would have made it back to UW without her being on nitric, or it would have been a close call without that.
The first step was to convert her from the strategy that was supporting her to one that would allow her to wake up and move, because she couldn't become a lung transplant candidate unless she was able to wake up and move. So we had to put her on the artificial heart-lung machine, something called ECMO, so that machine would take over the majority of the lung function.
For the next 4 months, a comprehensive team of caregivers worked to get Darlene eligible for transplant.
I had so many wonderful nurses and doctors while I was down there. ECMO specialists, I had respiratory therapists, there were physical, occupational therapy, speech therapy.
Everyone was invested in Darlene, especially the longer that she was there.
After months of hard work, Darlene was eligible for a lung transplant. She received the gift of life in March of 2022. In July of 2022, 10 months after she was initially hospitalized, Darlene was able to go home to her family.
It's really rewarding to see someone as sick as she was make it through everything she's been through and out the door and going home. It really means a lot to see people go through what she's gone and come out stronger.
I just hope that in hearing the story later, once they're older, that they can just see how much myself and their dad loves them. They were a driving force for us getting home. And I hope that they can just see the miracle that God performed in getting me better and getting me lungs and getting me home.
So Darlene's story is an extreme example of what we call prehabilitation, or getting patients stronger in preparation for a complex operation. Something that we had to do more than ever before during the COVID pandemic with so many critically ill lung transplant recipients. Next slide. Next slide. So again, thinking about this window of opportunity, although organ access allows us to identify a donor during that window, prehabilitation you can think of as extending the duration of that window. In Darlene's case, when she came to us, she was not a candidate for surgery, so we had to get her stronger. Next slide. The blue line here, you can imagine a standard transplant. Patients come in from home, they undergo a complex operation and lose significant strength. And then after transplant, they work to regain that strength to the point where they are strong enough and independent enough that they can leave the hospital. The red dotted line is unfortunately all too common. This is an example where patients, while they're waiting for transplant, deteriorate. And when that happens, they're less strong when it comes time for surgery. They become even weaker, and the rate of recovery is substantially impaired. In contrast, if we can prehabilitate these patients, get them stronger in preparation for surgery, then that drop at the time of the operation is reduced, which allows them to recover faster and safer. Next slide. There are a variety of principles of prehabilitation. It's not just about physical fitness, although certainly physical therapy is an important component. For lung transplant, respiratory therapy is an essential component. It's kind of like rehab for your breathing muscles. But other things like nutrition and mental health are essential. So it's really a multidisciplinary approach to getting patients fit for surgery. The picture here is an example of, again, sort of an extreme commitment. This is a patient with pulmonary fibrosis who completed the Seattle Marathon with multiple tanks of oxygen being sort of pushed behind him. And just sheer force of will getting him through 12 hours of walking to complete that marathon. Now, this patient was previously a competitive runner and what I would consider a Superman, because I can say personally, diet and exercise are hard enough for me. I can only imagine what it's like for patients that are literally suffocating to death. So it really takes a lot of support for most patients to do this extremely hard work. And in the next slide, you'll see some of the things that we're starting to do to better understand, the frailty and how we can address it. Through a collaboration with the scientists in the nutritional sciences department here, we're using novel imaging techniques to look not only at the bulk of muscle, but the quality of muscle. which is an indicator of how strong or fit patients are coming into surgery, with the idea that we can use that to help identify patients who are particularly at risk and eventually create solutions to address that specific sort of tailored type of frailty. Next slide. So here's an example of what we had to do to get Darlene stronger. You can play the video now, please.
I said, you're good. Nice job, Darlene.
Good job, Darlene. You're doing awesome.
Nice job. Good job, Bear. Darlene, so good.
Nice, Darlene. Strong.
So in that example, you can see that it really takes a village, physical therapists, nursing staff, respiratory therapists, ECMO specialists, all of these people involved just to get Darlene up and walking. And as you could hear, a committed husband cheerleading her through the process. Again, this is a really extreme example. When we met Darlene, she had been paralyzed and in a medically induced coma for 2 months. She couldn't even lift her arms or legs off of the bed. So this is really an extreme example, and it's a testament to the multidisciplinary care that she received. But really, if we can do this, you can only imagine what we could do if we took a similar approach, a comprehensive approach, a technologically driven approach to get patients who are less sick prepared for surgery. We could use things like personalized physical therapy intake, personalized therapy prescription, and a nutritional assessment combined with novel imaging markers to identify a specific plan for each individual to get them stronger, to address their unique elements of frailty before transplant. And we could combine that with remote monitoring tools like a Fitbit to measure their activity or their vital signs, or Bluetooth-enabled respiratory monitoring devices, all linked to a remote monitoring platform, which would allow us to detect progress, ensure that patients are going in the right direction, and find evidence early on if they're deteriorating, so we could change our strategy and ensure that we can maintain as low a waitlist mortality as possible. Next slide. Thank you all, and we look forward to your questions in the Q&A session next.
Thank you, Dr. McCarthy, for that excellent presentation. We're also going to be joined for some of the question and answer period as a panel by Dr. Erin Lowry. She's a faculty member in the Division of Allergy, Pulmonary, and Critical Care within the Department of Medicine. She serves as the medical director of the lung transplant program and associate medical director of the cystic fibrosis program. Dr. Lowry's clinical expertise includes providing complex care to patients with advanced lung disease and lung transplant, cystic fibrosis, and non-cystic fibrosis bronchiostasis. Dr. Lowry's research interests include outcomes in cystic fibrosis, lung transplant, as well as the clinical and immunological consequences of alcohol and substance use on patients with lung disease. So welcome, Erin, to our panel here. I'll give Dan, Dr. McCarthy, and Dr. Lowry a break, and I'll answer a couple of the questions that came in while we're waiting for more questions to come through the chat function here. I can answer a couple that came through during my presentation. One came through about living donors for kidneys when a transplant's being done in one room and the other room. So this is it's something that's happening less and less, I have to say. It's rare that we can block off 2 entire operating rooms for a kidney transplant these days due to or staffing availability. Usually what we do now is we have to do the donor in the morning, followed by the recipient in the afternoon. However, when we are able to have 2 side-by-side operating rooms, which is fantastic, we can actually time things quite well to the point that the kidney is only removed from the body maybe for an hour, hour and a half, depending on how well we can time these things. And during those times, again, there's nothing fancy being done. These kidneys are removed from the donor. They're flushed with University of Wisconsin solution or cold static storage solution, transported just across the hallway or across the next room in an ice bucket, where it may sit on the ice bucket for 60 minutes or 90 minutes before being implanted into the recipient. The other question that came up in the chat during my presentation was about the different organ modifications that are possible on these normothermic machine preservation platforms. Is this possible also in someone who has received an existing transplantation? Unfortunately, the answer right now is no. So there are always advances that are being made. The news is all over these stories about curing single gene defects with new technologies like using CRISPR or Cas9 to target certain gene defects and whatnot in patients. These are still a far way away from being rolled out universally. And the advantage, of course, as I mentioned, for the organ transplantation is inducing a protein to only be expressed in one organ and at a certain degree in one organ is really what we need. What we don't want is for that same protein to be expressed all throughout the body, because then that might impact, that's no different from immunosuppression. So therefore, we kind of just be globally immunosuppressing somebody as opposed to a localized organ-specific effect. And right now, if we just were to treat an entire person, there's no specificity that these treatments would just go throughout the entire body and kind of act as a regular immunosuppressant. So the short answer to the question is right now, no. However, there are emerging technologies to target certain cells and certain organs, which will be upcoming in the future. Maybe I can ask a question of Dr. Lowry, new to the conversation here. Since COVID lung disease is a new indication for lung transplant, do these patients have the same outlook and survival after transplant than their non-COVID counterparts?
Thanks, David. Yeah, it's still a very new indication, and so we don't have long-term data. However, as Dr. McCarthy explained in his presentation, much of the mechanisms of the COVID lung disease that people are going to transplant for is similar to pulmonary fibrosis, which is the top indication for lung transplant. So we would expect that the outcomes would be similar for those patients following transplant to those who have pulmonary fibrosis.
Dr. McCarthy, anything to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, David. I think that one of the challenges is that certainly early on in the COVID pandemic, a lot of the patients that were undergoing transplant for COVID were these really severely ill patients. And in fact, some of the debate at the very beginning of the experience of COVID transplant was, are these appropriate candidates for transplant? Because historically, many of these patients would have been declined. There are a variety of infectious diseases, the flu, adenovirus, other things that can cause devastating lung disease in select patients. And it was quite rare before COVID that we would transplant those patients. There's only a handful of those reported in the UNOS database over the prior 10 years before COVID. But what changed is we now had an overwhelming wave of otherwise healthy, functional individuals who were essentially dying in our intensive care units. And at some point, we said enough is enough. We just can't accept this. We're going to go for it. But we don't know. I mean, there is no good comparison historically for exactly how that looks. Some of the early data is very reassuring. There is early reports showing that even in these really ill patients, many of them are able to survive and maintain excellent function a year out. But again, there's just a limit. There's no way to know the long-term outcomes now because COVID just hasn't been around long enough.
Fair enough. Thank you. One other question in the chat said, "What happened to your beard in that third video?" I'm just joking. But sticking with the COVID theme, another question came in previously. Is how does COVID infection affect patients after lung transplant? I can tell you in terms of kidney transplant, when patients, COVID right now is actually the number one killer of patients post-kidney transplantation. It's the number one reason for graft and patient loss. So it does have a huge impact for kidney transplants, but I don't want to steal that question. So Dr. Lowry, how does COVID infection affect patients specifically after lung transplants?
Yeah, with COVID being a respiratory illness, obviously it has impacted lung transplant recipients quite specifically. So early in the pandemic, patients with lung transplant who would get COVID actually would get quite ill, suffering from COVID pneumonia and what we call ARDS, or the acute respiratory distress syndrome, and respiratory failure, with patients passing away from COVID quite rapidly. Fortunately, with better, as the therapeutics came out and vaccines, it's not quite as detrimental as it was in the beginning. However, COVID is still impacting our lung transplant recipients. So there's been reports that COVID infection can trigger rejection in our patients, both acutely and chronically. We sometimes see various different respiratory infections after COVID infections, so bacterial infections or fungal infections in the lung, which need extended treatment. And we sometimes see something called an organizing pneumonia, which means it's a response to the COVID infection of the immune system that creates like a pneumonia that can impact our patients. What we're not quite sure about yet is long-term, does it impact development of chronic rejection? And so we're still going to have to learn more over time exactly how COVID after lung transplant affects our patients. Fortunately, more lately, as I said before, with vaccines and Evusheld and some of the therapeutics, remdesivir and monoclonal antibodies, our patients have done better when they have come down with COVID, and some of our patients have even been asymptomatic through those infections. So it'll be interesting to see long-term how exactly COVID infection after lung transplant impacts our patients.
Absolutely. I think, since it is all just so new and it was this, 2-year blip of things, we still have a lot of data to analyze going forward, and especially in terms of chronic infection, which can take years to manifest. So absolutely, more to come on that. I'll take one of the other questions. I can tackle this one. Is the 3D printing of organs truly in our future? Is it just a fantasy? And which organs will be candidates? There was kind of a similar question in regarding xenotransplantation, or someone who's waiting for a kidney and a liver transplant. Are genetically altered organs an option? So I can tackle both of those. That 3D printing of kidneys or 3D printing of organs, I think is always one of these things that is always right around the corner. It's always one of these things similar to artificial kidneys or artificial hearts. It's always right around the corner. I'm not saying it's not possible. There are just many challenges besides just the scaffolding of producing the shape of the organ, but it's really infusing these organs with the multitude of different cells that are present in each one of these organs. No organ, a lung just isn't a lung cell, or a liver just isn't a liver cell. There's a multitude of other cell types. And so to create these type of 3D structures in a functional capacity is quite challenging. There is active research going on in these areas, but nothing that is clinically ready for prime time just yet. Similarly, with the xenotransplantation, or xenotransplantation means transferring an organ from across species barriers. Again, I'm sure most people have heard there were some big news stories late in the summer about people doing some genetically modified pig kidney transplants into decedent individuals or patients who were brain dead. This gathered a lot of media attention, and I think it really has sprung xenotransplantation back into the limelight again. Xenotransplantation is nothing new. It was people have been doing it for a long, long time. Didn't work at all. But I think these genetically modified animals are probably the best way forward. So again, in this day, technology that is rapidly advancing, a field that is rapidly advancing, has a new sprung due to the media coverage, has a new sprung light, and is now in the limelight again, with lots of different research going on for it. So hopefully, there will be a technology that will be available soon. In terms of kidney transplantation, we are involved in transplanting kidneys from genetically modified pigs. We're using a non-human primate model of this, spearheaded by one of my partners, Dr. Dickinson Kaufman. Again, just to show that these things are rapidly approaching and being researched on. Are there any xeno models for lungs?
So I'm not familiar with, I mean, certainly it's something that people are looking at, but honestly, I think in some ways it seems like in lung transplant, xenotransplantation is a little bit behind. But I will say in the broader field of thoracic transplant, so there was recently a clinical xenotransplant, into a heart recipient that had initial, decent graft function initially. The patient passed away after several weeks, but that certainly made a splash in the heart transplant world. And it reminds me of a quote from Norman Shumway, who's one of the sort of fathers of heart transplantation, which was that xenotransplantation is the future and always will be. And I think that, I don't know what he would say about Bart Griffith's recent transplant, but it does seem like something that is promising yet remains on the horizon in terms of clinical utilization.
Yeah, many things are always right around the corner, but hopefully we can get these things to fruition with proper research and well-conducted research. Absolutely. Dr. Lowry, maybe I can ask you another one of the COVID questions is what strategies have been implemented to help protect lung transplant patients from COVID?
Yeah, thanks. I mentioned some of them previously, but first and foremost, vaccines are probably our best tool at trying to prevent some of the bad effects that we've seen with COVID. And even though vaccine response in transplant recipients aren't as robust, getting those vaccines has made a big difference in our patient population in terms of how sick they get if they do happen to catch COVID. There are other things such as Evusheld, which is antibodies against COVID to help protect patients if they do come in contact with COVID. And of course, there's still masking and distancing and the availability of rapid antigen tests. So gathering outside is safest, but if you are gathering inside, I often recommend to my patients to take rapid tests so that there's an extra layer of protection when gathering.
Fair enough. Thank you for that. Okay, well, it's getting to be 8:15 here, so I'll just ask one more question. This is dedicated to kidneys, but what advances in kidney transplant and reducing rejection are on the horizon? So maybe I can just flip it and ask Dr. Lowry and Dr. McCarthy, what advances in lung transplantation is on the horizon? What's the new and upcoming thing that you could share with our audience tonight? Aside from the amazing presentation you already showed.
I think there's a lot of exciting stuff in the organ preservation arena. I think that's probably the most exciting and expanding area for lung transplant because lung tissue is so delicate. the challenge really is, how do you protect it when it's outside of the human body? And so some of the things highlighted by Dan tonight, I think really illustrate what's on the horizon for lung. And of course, treating it, so looking at that ex vivo lung perfusion technology where the lungs are sent and ventilated and perfused, during that time, can we actually treat the lungs and improve them even more so than when they were in the donor? So being very individualized in how those lungs are treated, improving them before implantation into a recipient. I don't know, Dan, if you have additional thoughts.
Yeah, I'll give you two. I'll give you one answer for the field and one answer for me. So for the field, I think exactly what Aaron just mentioned and what you included in your presentation, David, which is really using ex vivo perfusion as a therapeutic platform, as a way to make lungs better. Certainly, in terms of the immunologic response, I think that's really important for long-term outcomes. But I think in terms of the donor shortage, in the United States, only 20% of organ donors donate their lungs because of various injuries to the lung around the time of brain death. For example, pneumonia is one of the most common reasons that we have to turn down donor lungs. So if we were able to convert 20% utilization to 40% by finding some way to treat many of these pneumonias using an ex vivo system, I think that would have a dramatic impact on access, and it would essentially eliminate or nearly eliminate waitlist mortality. So that's for the field. For me, I think preservation techniques that allow extended preservation so that we can safely and reliably perform lung transplants at a reasonable hour instead of being up all night and not being home for bedtime and other things. I think that's what I'm looking forward to.
Fair enough. I like that a lot. I think the answer, this question came out for kidneys. I think you can replace the word lung with kidney there. We're all looking forward to the exact same advances. So I thank everyone who submitted questions previously, as well as the questions that have come through the chat. I also would like to thank Dr. Aaron Lowry and Dr. Dan McCarthy for presenting here today and joining the panel here today. We'll wrap it up, and thank you all participants for joining us this evening. I hope you've enjoyed the updates that we've given, as well as the presentations that we provided. And I hope it just highlights that, we are very excited about the amount of research that is being done at UW Health and Transplant, and looking forward to continuing this research in the coming years. And it really is made possible through generosity of donors, and great strides have been made. There's always more work to be coming in the future. Our next transplant update will be coming up in the spring of 2023. The topic will be updates in pediatric transplants. So please watch out for emails for those invitations. Dr. Kelly Collins, as mentioned earlier, is the new director of the kidney and liver surgical transplant programs. We'll also be sending some information in the coming days with a link to tonight's presentations, as well as more information how you can continue support through UW Health Transplant Center. In the meantime, please reach out to any one of the coordinators who were at the beginning of this presentation, as well as Mary Jo for more information. So thank you very much, and I hope you all have a good evening.